It's time for Around the Ozarks Sports Scene, brought to you by Fast Break Sports, the largest selection of cards and card supplies in Southwest Missouri. Now here's your host, Scott Puryear.
Welcome into another edition of Around the Ozarks Sports Scene. I am Scott Puryear. As always, thank you for tuning into the podcast this week. We're going to talk a little media, departing media, still here media, changing media. A lot of tags we can throw on Mark Spillane, the KY3 longtime sports director, long time being 6 years, and now transitioning into another role over at the station. Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott. I really appreciate it. You've got a great platform here, and you've left your mark certainly during your time covering sports here in the Ozarks, so always good to chat with you.
Well, thank you. I like this one because there's no time limit and nobody to tell me we're going to break, so I don't have to shut up at all either. So
Yeah.
It's a great deal. So kind of explain. You have stepped down as sports director. There is a new sports director in place now. What are you doing now for KY3 and for how long?
Yeah, that's right. Sully has taken over in sports, and I think the viewers are really going to like him. I think he'll do well here, and I think he'll like it here for sure. But as for me, I'm transitioning into a digital role. KY3 is looking to expand its digital platform, meaning, some more streaming options throughout the day in addition to the newscasts. And so we think there's a good market there for some extended interviews and different things like that. And so I'll be moving into a hosting role for those sorts of things. It'll be all kinds of topics, health news, some business news. There will be sports, of course. So, I'll get my sports fix. And then weather, it'll in some ways mimic some of the things we're already covering on TV, but in a more expansive way because we don't have to, cram things down into a 2-minute segment.
And will this be through the app or through the website or both? What's the plan?
So I know it'll be through the website, and I imagine it'll be accessible through the app. That'll be something I have to check on once we get things up and running.
Is there anything more we can pile on Chris Parker's plate? Because he doesn't have enough to do, so maybe we can work that into his job responsibility as well?
Don't worry. I've already got him slotted for about 30 minutes every Monday or Tuesday to come on and talk about his biggest reactions to whatever week just happened and what to look for coming up. I know he does a few minutes on Fridays as a look ahead with Chad on the morning side of things, but I'm going to drag him in there for the afternoon session as well, and we'll kind of recap mostly football, but dive into the other big storylines as well. So yeah. We're making sure that Parker has more to do. We're
always introducing him as the hardest working man in local sports because he is. The guy doesn't sleep. So, So kind of tell us, 6 years in Springfield at KY3, how you arrived here, your background before coming to the Ozarks.
Yeah, I came to the Ozarks from Wisconsin. That was where my first job was, and that was a really fun experience. Small market. Small station, really, you'd learn how to do a little bit of everything when you're working at a place like that because there aren't a lot of resources. But I got to cover a lot of Packers games and stuff, so it was a great introduction into some major sports coverage. And I went there, of course, from my home in New Jersey where I grew up. So this has only been my second stop on TV here at KY3, and it's a spot where, when I took the job in 2018 working on the weekends under Chad, I didn't think I would be here past the first contract. But, as things unfolded, I was looking, and the job market was was tough. It still is. It's just everybody's trying to do sports, and it's getting cut left and right. So there's not a lot of openings out there, especially when you're trying to move to the Northeast like I am. And so it wound up being just the best decision for Michelle and I to stay and extend for a few years and take over as sports director, and that's how we wound up here 6 years, and it's hard to believe that it's gone by so quickly.
Something interesting you brought up there, and I have a son that's a sophomore at Arkansas, majoring in journalism, and I guess my question is, if you could get up in front of a class of those kids right now and advise them, so to speak, on what path to take, what would you say with journalism in 2024 and the state it's in, especially on the sports side?
I would say that if it's something you think you're really passionate about and it's something you really want to do, which is how I've felt for the last several years, and still do, if there was an opportunity close to home to continue doing sports on TV, it's something that I would pursue. But I've had to expand my horizons to some other options just because of how competitive it is. And so I think I would probably tell kids like your son that you just have to be able to do a little bit of everything. You got to be able to write. You got to be able to edit, shoot your own video. If you're a writer, taking your own pictures is probably something you want to get good at. And, your son does a lot of the promotional stuff where, he gets to be really creative, right, with the hype videos and things like that. Mm-hmm. That's a great skill to have because that's so much of where things are going. And I suspect that those kind of positions will soon become similar to what, TV on-air people are dealing with, where everybody wants to do it, right? I think it's already becoming super competitive. So I think being able to do a little bit of everything is what sets you apart from some other people who might be applying for the same position.
And it wasn't that way 20 years ago, before social media and video really kind of took over. And I think one of the more impressive things about KY3, and full disclosure, I was there for a couple years back in the 2016-17 area, so I got to see it up close and personal, but with the Ozone magazine back then. And the Ozone had its own department and basically had about 5 or 6 employees. You can't really tell looking at the Ozone coverage now and the site that there's any different. Any difference now than it was 5-6 years ago, even though you got maybe about a fourth of the staff. And I'm sure that's got to be a credit to Parker and what he does in terms of the, directing, and pointing people in the right direction with stringers and people like that. But do you kind of step back and look and see what you guys do and are a little amazed like we are that it just continues to roll along with the same level of coverage?
Yeah, I'm super proud of the way it's looked these last several years that I've been involved with it. And you're right. Right before I got here, KY3 and KSPR, people probably remember, were actually their own separate entities, right? Mm-hmm. They were different things, but they were in the same building. But that meant 2 different sports staffs. And then in addition to that, to your point, there was an Ozone staff. So there were like 11 people doing local sports coverage and for the most part collaborating on things. And then when the stations merged, everything was trimmed down to 4 people. It's Parker, the sports director, the weekend sports anchor, and the sports reporter. And he does have access to all kinds of freelancers who shoot a lot of video or a lot of photos, rather, shoot a little bit of video from time to time, but mostly photos and write a lot of articles. But it really does come down to him and his planning and knowing what to cover and the collaboration between him and the sports director. And I think him and Sully will do really well in that regard. And it's something that I was really proud of him and I and the way we were able to collaborate things. We were always in lockstep. If I was talking about something on TV and promoting something on the website, it was for a reason. It was for a good reason that was there, right? It wasn't just run-of-the-mill, throw it out there because, we needed to fill time. And it is kind of impressive when you step back and look at it. There's no doubt about it. I tell people all the time that the Ozone is something that really doesn't exist anymore around the country. And really hasn't existed around certain parts of the country ever. Where I'm from, 45 minutes west of New York City, my high school didn't get any type of big-time coverage. Every now and then you might have one local website guy come by, and he'd be there, once a year. And that was it. And that's the case for a lot of kids around the country who live in maybe bigger metro areas. It's even true in St. Louis and Kansas City. But the Ozone, I'm so proud of what it does for kids here in the Ozarks and how it kind of amplifies what they're doing and makes it seem like it's a big deal all the time. And that's awesome for kids. That's a great experience. And the communities really respond to it. So I always try and encourage people that even though we might not get to everything all the time, to bear in mind that it is such a privilege to even have a guy like Chris Parker who puts in those hours and has that website attached to a station like KY3 willing to do that kind of coverage because it is few and far between.
Well, and for the old-timers like myself that, of course, I started 20 years in the newspaper industry when we had a staff of 8 or 9 reporters, and then desk people, and we had people that came in and answered the phones and took scores over the phone, and people woke up the next morning and saw an entire page of high school football line scores and, play-by-play touchdowns and box scores and things like that, stat packages. Now you got Wyatt trying to do the same thing, by himself. And it's a different world. And I think it's amazing on both ends what you guys and what Wyatt and the guys at Color have been able to still do to at least try to maintain some level of coverage. Because, you got here and you probably knew that high school sports were going to be big in the Ozarks, but then you got here and you probably realized even then it was a different level of big.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's never going to be the way it was when you were referencing, when you were doing the newspaper stuff. We're just never going to have that ever again. There's never going to be those kinds of resources dedicated to places like that, or even here at KY3. I watch so many people come through and then leave, but that's the nature of the news business now. It's something that I definitely wanted to kind of clarify a little bit, I guess, because I know on some of my social media posts, people were saying, oh, man, everybody's leaving KY3. KY3 can't keep anybody. It's not really a KY3 thing. That's local news now.
Yeah.
News reporters start out in places like KY3 or even bigger markets, and they move up so quickly. The hyper-competitive aspect of sports that I was talking about is not necessarily the same when it comes to news multimedia journalists. That's actually seen a shift the other way, where there are fewer people wanting to do it and therefore fewer qualified people. And so that's why you see so much shuffling with KY3. And mine just happens to be a more unique circumstance where we're just looking to get closer to home. But, the resources and stuff from back in the day, Scott, it's a time that's gone, and unfortunately not a time we're never going to see again.
And I think you touched on, we were talking about what you tell college kids, but your opportunity's right there at markets the size of Springfield right out of college. You look at on-air talent now, and I remember when, not to make it condescending, but you had to earn the right to be a reporter on KY3, and you might be on KSPR or another station or a smaller market, and you climb the ladder. Not just KY3, but everywhere else. We see, and I'm an old guy yelling at cloud, but you see kids now, kids that are on air, especially on weekends or on live reports and all that. That's the nature of the beast now. And I guess that's encouraging for those young kids that still want to be in journalism.
It is. The opportunities they're bigger and better. In sports, you seem like you still have to start in a small place. We've never hired anybody who didn't have any post-college experience in our sports department, and I don't know that we ever will, just because it's so competitive. But You're right. The opportunities to start in bigger markets is there for kids coming out of college, which is good and bad. It's good because you can make more money, because in those small markets, you don't make anything in local TV, much like the local newspaper business in a tiny market. Like, you don't make anything, really. And that's a good thing. It's a bad thing in the sense that more eyeballs, right? More pressure. It's a little more serious than Market 145. If you're coming out of college and you go to a place where there's not a lot of viewership, you got a little more leeway to make mistakes, right? And feel your way through some of the things you need to work on. When you jump right into a place like KY3, especially a legacy station like this that has such a stronghold in the market where viewers are constantly tuning in, you got a lot of people looking at you, and that can be a lot of pressure when you're 22 years old and you've never done this before. Absolutely,
and I think that's a credit with you guys to what Brian McDonough has done through these changing times to keep it all held together. You went through COVID and staff reductions and everything like that, and yet still the expectation is for you guys to still be KY3 and be the Ozone and do what you've done for many, many years there. And I guess back to the high school subject, when was the first time that you got here and realized that high school sports were a really big deal?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a specific thought or moment that I could point to. It was probably a collective, especially because my first year was going into the fall of 2018. And that 2018-2019, before COVID, the Ozarks had a really, really good couple of years across the board. But in football, there was one year where I went to cover the state championship games up in Columbia, and we had 3 teams there from the viewing area. Lincoln played in Class 1, and they almost won. I think they played Valley Catholic before the private school multiplier started moving them up, and they nearly won. And they're a fringe viewing area team, but they're in the coverage area. And Ava and Cassville were there too. And to have 3 teams there was pretty impressive, and to watch the way the communities really latched onto them was really an eye-opening experience for sure. To see, when I was there, I remember all 3 of those teams had more fans than the teams that they were playing, and it wasn't even close. I mean, the whole town of Ava was there. And I talked to Dan Swafford afterward, and they didn't really have a chance in the game. And Dan even said as much. He said, we were really just happy to have made it to this point. We knew today was going to be tough. I'm like, yeah, but you couldn't tell by looking in the stands because the whole place was there. You look across the way, and they had maybe 3 or 4 rows of people. So it told you everything you needed to know about the way that the communities in the Ozarks connect to the teams. And there were a bunch of moments like that. I mean, we had some great baseball players in the spring of 2019 that I got to cover right out of the gate, guys who are just finishing up their college careers now. So I think the collective of it that first year was where I was like, okay, this is definitely a place where people are passionate about this stuff.
Is it different here? Because you have been other places. I mean, is it different here than in Wisconsin? Is it different than, you mentioned it earlier, but what you grew up around in the New York area?
I'd say it's different than back home, just because there's so much going on in a place like New Jersey, right? You've got multiple NFL teams within an hour. You've got multiple hockey teams within an hour, baseball teams, and then a whole bunch of colleges as well. The colleges actually might be something that I've noticed in the Midwest is so much different than the Northeast. Like in Wisconsin, everybody's a Badgers fan, right? And then you come here to Missouri, and there's really only a few options, right? If you're not a Bears person, you're probably a Mizzou Tiger, unless you came over from Kansas or you came up from Arkansas. Maybe you came from Oklahoma, but everybody's got like their one college that they have allegiance to. And then back home, it's like there are so many different small colleges that there's not that big passionate fan base for as many of them. A lot of people are fans of like Notre Dame or Michigan, even though they never went there, right? So that's a big difference from back home. Wisconsin was similar to this. You get a lot of small towns where they really are just so focused on what's happening with the high school athletics, and those teams become so ingrained in the communities. So I definitely got to see that there too. But because of the coverage here, I think it becomes more amplified than it does in other places, which is, going back to what we said about the ozone, I think only helps grow it in a sense.
I think about all the things that you and we get to talk about and cover in our area, and the Bass Pro Tournament champions, the Springfield Cardinals, the Price Cutter Charity Championship each year. We've got Lunkers football now. You've got Missouri State, obviously, Evangel, Drury. Is there anything in particular that you really just kind of enjoyed more than anything else that really, like, hey, this is getting me pumped up for this week?
I think I enjoy it all, to be honest with you, but I love baseball, and having the spring cards here has always been a lot of fun, just because there's so much of a connection from Springfield to the St. Louis Cardinals, in part because Springfield is here. And it was kind of a funny personal connection for me because about 20 miles from where I grew up, there's a baseball stadium surrounded by a cornfield, and it's now home to an independent league team. I think they play in the Can-Am League. But when I was really young, I remember going to games there and actually going to concerts there as well. And it used to be one of the single-A affiliates of the Cardinals, and they were called the New Jersey Cardinals. So when I moved here and realized that Springfield was the AA affiliate, not a direct connection to the New Jersey team, but still pretty close. I thought that was really cool. And so I think probably having the Springbirds right here and being able to watch, basically the entire current St. Louis Cardinals roster, say what you will about it, most of it, came from right here in Springfield, guys we got to see in person, and I think that's really cool.
Who are your own personal sports favorites, team-wise, college, pro?
So I grew up a huge Yankees fan, Giants fan, and Devils fan. Luckily, never really cared about the NBA, which is good because I probably would have been a Knicks fan and been miserable. And my grandfather was, like many old Irish folks in New Jersey a huge Notre Dame football fan. So that's what I grew up with, and have had my disappointments aplenty from them in recent years as they continue to always be better than everybody except the actual 8 best teams. So they're just good enough to get close and get killed by one of them. That happens year after year. And actually was a huge Jeff Gordon fan growing up. Watched every single NASCAR race for, 10, 15 years. And really, kind of lost my love for that sport a little bit when he was gone. But growing up, I didn't miss a race, and Jeff Gordon was my guy. So, yeah, Yanks, Devils, Giants, Notre Dame, and Jeff Gordon.
So you're the person responsible for Notre Dame being on KY3 literally every Saturday then, right? It's still you keeping that alive?
I called up and I said, listen, if they're not on KY3, I quit.
I'm not watching them anymore. I'm done, yeah. So let me throw some topics at you, just kind of get your thoughts, mostly recent stuff. But Jackson Cantwell, what does the future hold for him? How fun has it been to follow that journey?
That's been a huge highlight of my time here. I'm also a big track and field fan. I absolutely love the sport. Unlike Jackson, I'm not 6'8", 300 pounds, so I was not a thrower. But I do have an appreciation for those kind of athletes, and he is just a marvel to watch. And he's a great kid, and I think that's probably the coolest part. One of my favorite stories that we've done was the story we did back in the spring of this past season when we featured Jackson and Hayden Mays together, because Hayden would be one of, if not the top thrower in the area, if not for Jackson being on his own team. And one of the best throwers in the state, if not for Jackson being on his own team. We'd probably be talking about him. And what I think is so cool is the relationship that those two guys have. Hayden is not bitter at all about having somebody like Jackson. You could tell he realizes and appreciates how special it is to have that type of athlete there. And get coaching from his Olympic dad. Of course, that always helps.
Yeah.
But Jackson is Hayden's biggest fan. So when Hayden's throwing, Jackson's the one cheering him on. And every time we would interview Jackson after a big meet, he'd always, finish up a soundbite by saying, and Hayden too, Hayden threw great. Did you see Hayden throw? And so their friendship has been really cool to watch. But Jackson is certainly very special. And I'm just so curious to see what his choice will be down the line. If he wants to pursue football fully, and does that mean giving up track eventually? Or does he want to pursue the Olympic side of that? And would that mean giving up football fully? I don't know. Maybe he could do both. I just feel that it would be really hard to get all the way to the top in both. Collegiately, I think he can do it just fine. But I'm curious to see if, there comes a time where he decides this is the sport I want to go after, and I'm going to have to leave that other one in the rear view to do it.
Jackson and Hayden are Ricky Bobby and Cal Naughton Jr., and I just wonder if Hayden asks him every now and then, hey, can I win this time? And Jackson's like, no, that's not the way this works, and stuff. But it is amazing. And if Jackson were going to somewhere in Columbia or Jeff City still, Hayden would be, the focus guy in the weights down here in our area. You're absolutely correct there. Next topic, Missouri State to Conference USA. Your thoughts on that? Is it an exciting time? Is it a precautionary tale about some things that need to be cleaned up before they can do it financially, things like that? What are your thoughts on the whole move?
I think long-term it's a great idea because I think what you see around the country is it's really hard to have that national relevance, which opens up so many doors if you're in the FCS level, unless you have an elite level basketball program. And when you look around, you look at a North Dakota State, South Dakota State, the elite FCS programs, their basketball programs are okay, but they're not turning any heads, and people in other places that don't follow the Valley are not saying, oh yeah, did you see the Jackrabbits basketball team last night, right? So I think long-term, getting out of that bracket and into the upper echelon is ultimately where they want to be, and I think it's a good move. I think there are going to be a lot of growing pains to get there, and they've been open and honest about the fact that they are tens of millions of dollars away from being able to have the facilities that are on par with their competition. So I appreciate that they've been very candid about that, because it's true. And that's going to be the biggest challenge of all for whoever they choose as this new athletic director, right, is raising the money necessary to try and get up to speed with some other places. Because you just look around Conference USA, and even if you just go to like the teams that were worst in football last year, and then you look up their facilities, and they're light years ahead of where the Bears are right now. So that's going to be a huge challenge, but I think years down the line, people in the area will look back and say that was the right move to make that jump when they did, because look where we are now.
I think the first AD candidate came in and was the one that said, I want to raise $100 million for football, and he's also the first guy to pull out of the race. So I wonder if somebody said, that's not going to be easy at all anywhere, and especially here. Yeah. But
maybe not. But, I mean, look at all the businesses we have around here, right? There's definitely money out there. You just got to figure out how to get it from
Well, and that goes back to they have to get excited about the product. And I guess that kind of segues into my next topic is the basketball situation with the Bears and Lady Bears and fan interest. And Wyatt did a great series of stories on that and the marketing and all that. What do you see when you see a Division I team that's having trouble getting more than 2,500 to 2,000 to 2,500 people in the actual building?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. And unfortunately, I think some of those things are just simply out of the control of Missouri State or any university for that matter, with the access to every game you could ever want at any time being part of it, right? If you're sitting at home and you're a huge college basketball fan and maybe there's a couple of really big games on, do you want to go to the Bears game and watch those games on your phone, or would you rather just stay at home and be able to watch those games on your TV, right? So, you're fighting with that. And then you're also fighting with the fact that it's hard to identify with the players because there's so much movement with the new rules of the transfer portal. And I don't know how you get that back on track. And Isaac Haney is always the guy that I point to, because when he started playing late in his freshman year, even though he wasn't lighting up the scoreboard, he would make a few plays here and there, and you could tell there was some juice to people wanting to watch a local kid play for the Bears. And you don't have that when you're not able to get local guys to play there. So that's part of it. But even if they're not local, if you could have a guy come in and stay 3-4 years, then people get to know him. They get to see him as a person beyond just some guy on the court. And then it's easier to root for that person, right? Because you know him a little bit. Maybe you've seen him in the community. You've talked to him a little. So I think that those are some of the things that they're fighting against. And certainly the product helps. If you're winning games, that stuff doesn't matter nearly as much. But it's always going to be something that they have to combat. It's much different than Konzo's last time here. So I'm curious to see how he tackles a lot of those issues.
Yeah, he never had a portal to deal with. He was out at Mizzou when all that started firing up and NIL and everything. So it is probably going to be an eye-opening world for him as well. I just think back to Tom Hanks and League of Their Own, and there's no crying in baseball. There's no leaving before football. Nobody leaves right before the football season. And I know you're going to use the company line about I wanted to give the new guy, Sully, a chance to get his feet on and underneath him before football started. But along those lines, how exciting is the new look COC with Kickapoo, Glendale, Lebanon, Waynesville coming in and joining an already just stacked league?
Yeah, it's always funny because, you would look at the COC and the OC and maybe, Kickapoo was having a great year, or Glendale was having a great year, or Lebanon, and you'd go, yeah, but I want to see them play Webb City, or I want to see them play Nix, or I want to see them play Republic, in last year's case, right, or Carthage a few years ago. And unless they happen to cross paths with Carthage and Lebanon did a few years ago, and I was actually at that game, and it was awesome, you didn't get to see a lot of those games. And so unless you were deep in the playoffs, I'm excited to be able to see those kind of on a week-to-week basis now, and I think it's great for football fans around the area, and it's going to make those teams that were in the OC a lot better over the course of these next few years as they work to catch up to what was the premier conference in the area.
Yeah, looking at, we had John Perry on last week, and looking at Nix's schedule, I mean, my gosh, it's matchup after matchup that if you could write up dream matchups, that would be it. Nixa Republic, Nixa Joplin, Nixa Webb City, Nick's a Kickapoo, Nick's a Lebanon. I mean, it's going to be a fun ride for following as a fan to follow week to week what happens in that league.
There's no question about it, and that's the type of stuff John Perry is looking for, right? Because he's said it time and again. They've accomplished what they want to in terms of the conference and regionally here in the Ozarks. Now it's about being able to take down those teams from Kansas City and St. Louis when it gets deep into November and into December and try and take home a state championship.
Last short topic, Ned Reynolds. You come to town from Wisconsin, you grew up in the upper Northeast, kind of like he did, and you get here and you hear about this old guy that's been around forever. Talk about the relationship with Ned. I know he respects the heck out of you because he would tell me in the mornings on radio, let's get Spillane on and stuff. Kind of just talk about how, he's been a help to you and your thoughts when you first got here. And I got to interview this old guy every Monday.
Yeah, when you were asking earlier about some of the more unique things of the Ozarks compared to other places, and Ned may be the most unique aspect of the whole thing. We talked about the turnover in local TV. People like Ned, and we have a few here at KY3, right, with Steve and Lisa and Ron have all been here a long time. Steve's been here 50 years now, which is incredible. But even Ned had a longer run than anybody else has, and he's still going, of course, and, in his quote-unquote part-time capacity. You just don't see a lot of people like him. And I have more respect for that guy than I could ever really, verbalize, just because he's such a figurehead in this community. It's really amazing. And he's one of the first people that people ask about when, they would find out what I do for work. They'd say, "Oh, do you know Ned? Have you ever met Ned?" And I always have to laugh because it's like, yeah, I've met Ned. I talk to Ned every week on TV.
Yeah.
And, I know the guy really well, actually. And I always tell a story, and I told this on the air during our last Monday weekend recap segment. And I'll share it again here for anybody who maybe hasn't heard me say it before. But about a month or so after I started here 6 years ago, I was at Ned's favorite spot over just off of Battlefield Road. Everybody who knows Ned knows what I'm talking about. He was hanging out there having a few sodas, and I stopped in there with my now wife, at the time girlfriend, Michelle, and he happened to be standing at the bar. I didn't even know he was in there. At the time, I didn't know this was his favorite place. So I walk in, there he is, and I said, "Oh my gosh, that's Ned from work, the guy I told you about that I've gotten an interview a couple times, and I've talked to. Let's go over there. I'll introduce you." So we go over there, and I introduce Michelle to Ned. And Ned's somebody who's got enough stories to do, a month's worth of these podcasts without you ever having to ask him any questions. God, he could just talk the whole time because he's had so many interesting experiences. For a guy like that, he spent the entire hour we were there asking Michelle about her and her background and her family and, what it's like adjusting to Missouri and this and that. And I thought that was so telling about him as somebody who could do the talking and the telling of stories. He didn't care about that. He was interested in learning more about her and us and our backgrounds back home. And I just thought that was so cool. And that told me everything I needed to know about him a month in, and that's been the same ever since.
Well, ever since he told the kid to beat it at the Ozark Empire Fairground back 30 years ago, live on camera, he literally is one of the most charming people you'll ever meet. Especially with new people like your girlfriend / wife there. And people love him, especially the female persuasion when they come up to meet him like that. Now, I didn't see that Ned in the mornings quite often. At 7 a.m. or 8 or 9 a.m., whatever time it was. Not quite as charming, but will always be a friend of mine and no greater vault of knowledge in the Ozarks. And I'm sure that was something you tapped into occasionally as well, right?
Constantly. It's so nice that you have that resource when you're working at KY3 doing sports. And just a couple instances come to mind. The passing of Whitey Herzog, the passing of Bill Verdon, both times. The first thing I did was pick up the phone and call him and say, "Ned, this just happened. I'd love to get your perspective on it." And he'd come in, we'd sit down, and we'd talk, and he would tell a great story, maybe a time he interviewed one of those guys. And he just would add a little personality to it, of course, because half the time they were here to be roasted or something, and he would be like the host of this roast that they would do. old-time events like that. And just be able to call him up and have that resource right there, that is so unique. That does not exist in almost any place around the country. And so I'm super, super grateful to have that as well.
Well, back to the charming part. I mean, that's why he and I teamed so well together. I was used to being the horse's rear as a sports columnist in the area, so I've slid right into that role with him on radio because we had to maintain that pristine image, of the guy that absolutely will not make a prediction that's not riding the fence, and let me be the sacrificial lamb. That's how that rolled for about 15 years, but I loved every minute of it. And if you're just tuning in to the podcast, if you somehow fast forward, Ned is not dead. This is not a eulogy. He is living. No. So let's not be mistaken about that. He is still alive and kicking and doing
right. I actually talked to him about a half an hour ago.
Yeah.
I just called him.
So we have confirmation that he's still with us. But kind of wrapping this up, what are you going to remember most? I mean, you're not going anywhere right now, but you will eventually. But what are you going to remember most about your time in the Ozarks?
I think the impact that you realize KY3 has on the area and being a small part of that, the video that I posted of me saying goodbye to everybody, I'm not doing sports every night anymore, so you won't see me here kind of goodbye, I'm not leaving yet, but I'm leaving, in the 2 weeks since, or not even a week and a half since, I think on Facebook that video has been viewed like 25,000 times. And it's got so many comments, and just when you read through them, and I tried to acknowledge every single one of them. I hope I didn't miss anybody, but when you read through them, you realize just how impactful it is to be on somebody's television set each night for that period of time, and how you really, get to be a part of their lives. And I hope that everyone was able to tell just how much energy and effort was put into our daily coverage, because I poured a lot into it, and to be able to see that impact play out, I think is probably the thing I'll remember the most. Because there's some stories, some interviews, some things that that we put on TV that I'll never forget when somebody reaches out and says, "Hey, I watched that story you did on my nephew or my grandson or whatever, and I cried watching it, and thank you so much for doing that," because that's what it's really about, right? Like, that's the best thing you could possibly do, because you've made a viewer for life when you do that. And so I think that's the stuff I'm going to remember the most.
What is that dream next job back home in the East for you? I mean, what are you looking for?
It's interesting because, I worked for a year before I went on the air. I worked for a year at MLB Network and NHL Network, which are both in New Jersey on their assignment desk. And when I left, that's where I wanted to get back to. And I wanted to get back there to do baseball and hockey. And it's just so difficult to get to that level. Not because it's difficult to get good enough to be at that level. It's just difficult to get that opportunity. And even with the connections that I have there, like, there's just, the opportunities just aren't there for that sort of thing. Even though I personally feel like, I feel like I could step in and do that job now, because in my opinion, it's the same thing. There's more viewers, but the process is still the same. So that still ultimately would be the dream. But dreams change, right? And what you're looking for changes. And being so far away from family and friends for 8 years and having to go through so much time and effort and energy just to get back home for everything that we've wanted to attend and the things we've had to miss because of that, makes you appreciate the location of where you are more than you did in the beginning of a journey. And so I'm not so sure that my dream job isn't something else altogether. It might be doing something outside of TV where I still have time to do something like this, do a podcast or,
sure,
break down some things on social media. And, I've posted a few videos here in the last week or so now that I've had a little more time on some different topics, like why the Cardinals are only batting Jordan Walker against lefties, even though he's better against righties, random stuff like that. Things that interest me and hopefully will interest the people that want to watch them. And if not, that's okay, because it'll at least scratch that creative itch for me that I won't have if I wind up not doing TV.
I'm a little freaked out by those videos because it's like your head's just kind of hanging there in limbo and suspension there on those, so I've got to get used to that. And it's like the powerful Oz is kind of, coming through there. But, and wherever you land, Wyatt and I are still a little aggravated that I've got some Spillane to do, never really made the air, in terms of segment. That's got to be a goal of yours for the next stop. But, we'll make sure and hold you to that. But Mark, you've been great to work with here. Appreciate your time. You're not going anywhere yet, so people can still watch you online with KY3 and their platforms. But sure appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me, Scott. This has been a blast. I really appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Best of luck to you.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for another edition of Around the Ozarks Sports Scene. Thanks for tuning in. A big thanks to our sponsor, Fast Break Sports, your home for all things sports cards and collectibles over on South Campbell. We're actually setting up a return visit to Fast Break to do the podcast live over there, so we'll kind of jump into the collectible side again for the fall and the football season and have a special guest that is a frequent customer of theirs that'll join us for that podcast as well. So that's going to wrap it up. We will see you next week on Around the Ozarks Sports Scene.